So I want to make one final pass to my snowman and add some details, like maybe add some buttons and add some details to the hat and continue to refine my snowman. But I also want to think about the environment that I'm in, and I'm not so much worried about my lighting at this point. I'll catch up on that in a future presentation. But what I really want to focus on is the elements that are inside my scene. And so currently, if I do a quick render, this is what my scene looks like. Not very impressive, but with just a little consideration, what I can do is start to introduce an environment. And I'll share with you a couple of different ways, some results that we can get really quickly. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change my layout back to standard or startup. Standard and startup are going to be about the same thing. So from this viewport, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and hold on the Environments tab, and that's just to the left of the cameras. If I click and hold here, and you can see that I have a couple of different options here. What I want to do is I just want to introduce a sky into the equation. And what a sky is going to do, it's going to introduce an object into my object manager, and when I render it, you can immediately see that I'm no longer looking at the black background that I had been looking at before. So that goes a long way. This is something that can receive a texture, and so if we want to control the color of the sky, we can just drag an existing texture on it or create a new texture. But the sky is basically it's a very large sphere object. It does have some special properties which we'll talk about later, but we can map images and colors to it. In addition, what I'll do is I'll go back under the parametric primitives and I'll introduce a landscape object. Now, in order to see this a little bit more clearly, I'm going to get rid of the cube object that I had as the ground, and I'm trying to remember where that object was. I might have grouped it in with the body. I'm looking for it, and I don't see it, so I'm going to cheat simply by clicking on the object, and now I can see that I left its name cube. No wonder I couldn't find it. So I'll delete that cube object, and I'll focus on the landscape object. Now the landscape object is kind of cool. Already we can see that we have this kind of rough surface, and the way that the landscape object works is it works very much like a plane. I'm going to set the size. I'm going to bump this up. Maybe I'll start off by going like 2,000 centimeters. I'll leave the height fairly low. I'll come back and adjust that later by 2,000 centimeters. And then what I can start to do is play with some of these variables. There are rough furrows and fine furrows and scale. And as I start to bump that up, I can start to manipulate how smooth or how rough that shape is. Okay, now I'm not getting very dramatic results because there's a combination of things that we need to factor in. There's the furrow value, but then there's also the y-axis information. And right now we've set it to a maximum height of 100 centimeters, but as we start to increase that, you can start to see that, you know, we're getting a much more dramatic display of these rough furrows and fine furrows. Okay, so I'll just kind of smooth those out a little bit just by playing with some of these values. Maybe I'll even bump up the size of this a little bit larger to 3,000. I'm just using the tab key to jump to the different fields. That looks pretty good. Now instead of moving my snowman up, I'm going to select my landscape and move it down. Okay, now I don't have to do this all in one landscape. I can combine and introduce some additional landscapes, and so that did okay to start to think about my environment. With a quick render, I can see that I have something that's much more interesting to look at. And maybe I'll even throw the snow texture on it so that it kind of starts to blend a little bit with the snowman. And that looks alright, but I also want some information in the environment and in the background, and what I can do is, just in very simple terms, I could create some really super stylized trees. And I'll do this by creating a pyramid object. Now, for the sake of this demo, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this pyramid over, and I'm really not even going to change what the standard shape looks like. And I'm going to use this technique of duplication, and I can find that under Tools, Arrange Object, and I'm looking for Duplicate. So I'll click on Duplicate, and the way that duplication works, it's kind of an interesting process inside Cinema 4D. Once I hit the Duplicate button, what I need to do is go to the Attributes Manager, and you can see that it says duplicate here. Now we're not duplicating anything yet, we still got to give it some more information, and currently what this field is saying is that, okay, it's going to duplicate and make 8 copies. The clone mode or copies, that's fine, but the options mode, or the mode at which we are generating our clones, or our copies, we could either do it in linear, circular, or along a spline. And what I want to do is I want to do linear. Okay, and once I do that, you can see that I have more options. And it's asking me for a position change, and currently what's happening is it's going to duplicate this object 8 times, and it's going to, every time it duplicates, it's going to move the object up along the y-axis 500 centimeters. That's way too high, so I can bring that value down, and I'll do that later. But I could also scale, and I could rotate these things. But the really cool thing about duplication is that once I tell it which mode to duplicate in, so let me just move this up so you can see this a little bit more clearly. I'm telling it to duplicate 8 times, and I have some information here, but it's duplicating 8 times. The mode I've chosen is linear, and once we choose a mode, what we can do is we can hit apply. Now it's generated duplicates. It's kind of hard to see because it's actually off screen. I can tell because I have a copy of pyramids, a group of pyramids in my object manager. Now I haven't selected anything because I don't want to lose focus on the object manager. And the cool thing is I'll just bring these duplicates down. You can see that as I move those down, the cool thing about duplication is when you duplicate something, as long as you don't select something else, you can modify these values in real time. And so what I can do is I just adjusted how far this moves. Okay, and I am going to change my composition a little bit here. Maybe I'll enable scaling. And so I can scale these, and I'll just choose 80% in all directions, or maybe I'll choose 80% in everything but the height, which would be the center value would be the y, and or we could just play with these values and see what we get. Whenever we see 3 values stacked in order, they're typically x, y, and z, and so I had a sense that that was going to be the y-axis. And I'll also enable rotation, and I don't want to rotate it along any axis except for that first, because if I do, then oops, I just hit undo and it undid everything. So let me hit apply again. There we go. I'll set this back to 0 because that was actually the effect that I was going for. But once I start playing with these fields, we'll discover very quickly which way we want to rotate these things. So maybe for this project, I don't want to rotate that way. I don't want to rotate that way, even though those make very cool, you know, visually very interesting solutions up there. What I want to do is I want to rotate this, and I'll just probably, you know, maybe I'll rotate this like 20 degrees or something. And I'll just kind of play around with this. And I think I have too many copies, so I can even bump down the number of copies. I'll continue to rotate this. And so something like that is what I'm looking for. And I'm just trying to, you know, create a technique that will really quickly allow me to build kind of like a pine tree. Okay, and I'll just kind of raise those up a little bit. And I'm fairly satisfied with that, so now I can lose focus of my duplication menu. And when I do, if I select anything else, now I've lost the ability to control that duplication again. So if I want to go back and try this again, or create a different solution, you know, I can either go into the pyramid copies. This is all the copies that it made, but I can't numerically control those the same way that I did. So if I wanted to do that, what I need to do is just delete the copies, go back to pyramid, go to tools, arrange object, duplicate, and it remembered the same parameters that I used last time. So I'll change that to linear, make sure that's in place, and I should be ready to go. Now, for whatever reason, it's not letting me hit the apply button, and so I'm going to change the number of copies, and immediately that introduced, I don't know why, it might have been just a little bug, but I just changed the value really quickly. So that looks pretty good, and now I can continue to manipulate that. But I'm happy with that. And then the next technique that I'll use is I'm just going to expand the object menu here of the pyramids, and I'll drag and drop snow on one of the objects, and I'll build this kind of real quick green texture. So I'll just call this green for now until I think of a better name. And I'll just do kind of this dark piney green. And I'll take that green texture, and I'm just gonna, every other every other model, I'll throw an alternate texture on it so I get this kind of, you know, almost this snowy tree effect. Okay, so I'm just really kind of thinking about ways that I can, you know, really quickly create some information inside the environment. And now if I want to move that tree around, I have the original pyramid object that I created, and then I have all the copies that were generated, and I really want to treat both of these objects like one object. And so the best thing to do when you're in that situation is I could shift click, or I could click and drag and get my marquee to get all that information selected, and I can choose object, group, so I can group the objects, and now I can just simply call this tree. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. If I were to create a HyperNerbs object and drop that whole tree in there, okay, not exactly what I wanted, so I'll undo, but I could make some changes in the original geometry, and I'd want to do that before I duplicate it to get a slightly different result. So I'll continue to play with that, but that's a real quick technique to generate a tree. I'll copy and paste and move my trees around, and I'll generate a couple of others that have a slightly different, you know, slightly different variation on it, so they all don't look the same. And I'll use that same technique to create some mountains in the background. And I'll do some of this stuff offline, but I'll use the, you know, same techniques, just experimenting with some of the shapes that I know I have control over. In the next presentation, we'll talk a little bit about you know, really kind of bringing this project to a conclusion by adding those details. Maybe I'll throw some snowflakes into the scene, and I'll consider the sky, but most importantly what I'll do is I'll really think about the lighting and the quality of render. And we'll do that in the next presentation.